So I haven't done a bebop scale workout video in a while, and this time I thought it would be a good idea to look at bebop scales or bop scales or Barry Harris scales, if you will, over what is this thing called love. I'm not gonna explain bop scales here because I've already done that many times in previous videos that go way back. I recommend the first videos I did on bop scales, one on bebop scales over blue bossa or the one on Donna Lee, I think, are good examples of where I explain bop scales. You could think of these as bop scales or the Barry Harris 6 diminished scales, which I've also explained in the past, and we're gonna look at them and how you can use them over this tune, and let's get started, shall we? First off, we need to decide what the chords are in this tune and that we're gonna think of in this tune and which scales that go with those chords. So it starts with a C7 to F minor 6, G7 to C6, some kind of C6 chord, C7 flat 9, F minor 6, G7 to C6. Then we have F7 to B flat 6, to A flat 7, G7. Then the A section returns. So I'm simplifying the chords here, but we're actually playing the chords that are closer to the original version, I think. I think most of you have seen 2, 5, 1 and a 2, 5, 1 to C. And sometimes it's a D minor 7 flat 5. Sometimes it's a regular D minor. But we're not even worrying about that. We're just looking at the dominant chord. This is the Barry Harris trick. So just the C7 to F minor 6, G7. And then for the next section, it's just F. So the scales that we're gonna use are major bop scales over the major chord and dominant bop scale over the dominant chord. But if it's a dominant chord that goes to minor, which we have the first chord, we're gonna play a mixo flat 2 flat 6, also known as Phrygian dominant. And we're gonna add a major 7 to those dominant scales. For the minor chord, I'm gonna play a minor bop scale, F minor bop scale, which is a melodic minor with an added flat 6. G7 is a dominant scale, just a mixo with a major 7. And then we have the C, we're playing a major scale with an added flat 6. So from the top. I'm playing them descending, starting on the roots. Then we have an F7 coming up, right? B flat major, A flat dominant mixo, and G dominant. I'm using the same backing track I used in the previous video. It's called Learn a Jazz Standard, so I'll put a link to it. many things you could do to these scales. You could start on different beats, you could play them ascending, all sorts of things. We're gonna look at some ideas, what you can do more than this. But first off, you should practice them descending, starting on all the chord tones. So each of these scales have 4 chord tones and 4 passing notes. That's the beauty of this. If I take the C major, for example, it's a chord tone, passing, chord tone, passing, chord tone, passing, chord tone, passing, and so on and so forth. So what you should do first is start on all the chord tones. We have to remember on the tonic chords, the 6th is the chord tone, not the 7th. This is what's a little bit different than more contemporary way of thinking about jazz harmony. So you can start on the root, the 3rd, the 5th, and the 6th. And you can land on that 6th. It's a chord tone. It's a resting quality to it. The same with minor, right? It's a F minor. It's starting on root, 3rd, 5th, or the 6th. On the dominant chords, it's the, like we normally think about it, right? Like the root, the 3rd, the 5th, and the 7th. So you should be able to start on any of those notes. Let's just do, for example, the 7th. So for dominant chords, it's gonna be the 7th. For major chords, it's gonna be the 6th. And for minor tonic chords, or in this case, in any minor chord, it's gonna be the 6th. I'm not gonna give you all the chord tones, starting all the chord tones, because we need to kind of move on here, but I'll show you just one example of what you can do with Bebop scales. Here I can add the Thank You David Baker. Thank you David Baker. So maybe if I start on B2, it doesn't work there. You have to treat that as a regular dominant chord, which you can do, but we're not gonna do it there. But here, so adding the Thank You David Baker, starting on B2. Here we go. Another common thing to add is, and I've done this in previous videos. That's another common thing. So it's Thank You David Baker. David Baker is this famous jazz educator, and he often talks about this stuff. So we used to joke about that, like Thank You David Baker, when I was in jazz school. Or so you can add like jazz idiomatic phrases to these bop scales to make it sound less like scales and more like bebop language. Speaking of bebop language, one common thing to do is to add a triplet. On the first note, but it's important to understand that you could start the bop scales on the passing notes too. Then you just have to ignore the chromatic note, right? So here that is actually the first note, kind of, that we're playing. So here is no different. So I'm just adding a triplet, right? Sounds like Charlie Parker. The way I think about this is this note. That's the first note. So whatever I'm doing before that, as long as I land on the chord tone on that beat. So that's the chord tone, and then I'm just kind of continuing on the bop scale. So I'm not playing the passing note here, because then it wouldn't add up. I would be on the passing note on the strong beat. You want to be on the chord tone on the strong beat and a passing note on the weak beats. So if you start on a passing note, you have to wait until you arrive at the chord tone on the strong beat and then just continue with the scale. Hope that made sense. You could start on any note and do the triplets. If I start on the ninth, then I have to add the chromatic notes so that I end up on a chord tone on that strong beat. B flat. So I'm just starting on the ninth. There it is. So I'm using slides, and that's legato, right? And then I'm picking the other notes. So it's a little bit inconsistent. I don't have like a formula for the fingerings or anything like that, but I've also made a video in the past where I talk about bop scales and fingerings. The first scale I tend to do like this, right? With the index finger. I wouldn't do... It just feels wrong to me. But I'm not sure why. Another thing you may be noticing is that I'm sometimes playing an extra note at the end. It's like a jumping off note or whatever. It could be any note. So it sounds like the diba 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 bebop. Diba 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 bebop. Diba 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 bebop. So it's kind of fun. You can add any note. It could be in the chord tone, could be an extension. Could be a dissonant note even. Like a tritone. It sounds like kind of Dizzy Gillespie if you do that, right? So I got these notes from Barry Harris' workshop or a clinic, and somebody transcribed what he's saying there, and I'm gonna take some of those ideas because he's doing this. He thinks of these scales a little bit differently. He thinks of them as major diminished because it's a major chord, major 6 chord, and a diminished chord, alternating, right? So, which is also something I've covered many times, so I'm not gonna go into it again. And but anyway, there are things that you can add, as it were, to these scales. You could, for example, do this. You could go up to the 3rd, and then chromatically down from the 3rd, and then continue on the Bebop scale. So I'm going up, and then from that 3rd I'm going down chromatically all the way till I'm landing on that root again, and then continuing on the Bebop scale. You can't do it on minor chords, so I'm just gonna play like that. But here, you could even do, it sounds fine. Let's try it over the backing track. Another thing I'm doing sometimes is when I hit that E, I can play the arpeggio. But Barry Harris called this pivoting. Instead of going up the octave, he goes down. Very Charlie Parker thing to do, right? If I do that triplet starting on the 9th, also I'm doing, I go up to the sharp 9 instead of going up. If I went up strictly to the scale, it would be, I think it sounds better with the flat 9. You can do the same here. You could flatten those obviously on the G7 as well. So you see how this bop scales could kind of lead you into the bebop language territory if you know how to attach idiomatic bebop phrases and licks to these scales. And here I just want to take a moment to, because this always comes up this discussion with students when they hear this and they're like, yeah, this is all good, but the problem is I'm gonna sound like everybody else. I'm just playing cliches, blah blah blah. I've talked about this many times. And so then they make this mistake of thinking, oh, I shouldn't practice that stuff because I don't want to sound like everybody else. And I'm just gonna be quick here and repeat what I've said before, that the answer is you do practice it so that you know it so well, in and out, in any key, any fast tempos. Then you do something else. You build your own language on top of this stuff. Anyway, that's how I think about this. Are there guitar players who have never practiced this stuff ever? Sure. But a lot of them also have practiced this stuff. One of my favorite moments in jazz college was when I was in Pat LaBarbera's class, and he handed out sheets of just bob scales, like written out bob scales like this, like we're doing now, right? And one of the students was like, yeah, I don't like this because I don't want to sound like this. I want to sound like Joe Henderson. And Pat LaBarbera said, look at the bottom of the page. And it said, by Joe Henderson. It was Joe Henderson's writing, right? So that goes to show that players like Joe Henderson have also practiced this stuff. All right, so that was some ideas on how to use bob scales over what is this thing called love. Check out my other videos. You can just type my name and bob scales or Barry Harris scales and try it over other standards. And if you join us on Patreon, you get access to all the PDFs that goes with these lessons. So with all that, I want to thank you for your time and attention, and I shall see you next time.